In the soft twilight between myth and memory, where the Aegean winds carry whispers of ancient stories, there stands a hill that has watched civilizations rise and fall like seasons turning. Here, where Europe meets Asia across a narrow strait, the earth holds secrets older than written words. Layers of stone and pottery, bronze and gold, speak of lives lived in the shadow of legend. This is not merely a place marked on ancient maps, but a crossroads of human dreams and ambitions, where heroes walked and poets sang, where the very concept of epic storytelling was born. The dust beneath our feet mingles with the ashes of Troy, where love and war, honor and betrayal played out across centuries in stories that would echo through eternity. Close your eyes and feel the Mediterranean breeze that once filled the sails of bronze-hulled ships, carrying warriors and merchants to this fabled shore. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The Troad Peninsula stretches like a gentle hand into the waters where the Aegean Sea meets the Sea of Marmara, its fingers touching the shores of ancient dreams. Here, in the northwestern corner of what we now call Turkey, the land rises and falls in soft hills, crowned with olive groves and scattered with the white stones that gleam in Mediterranean sunlight. The Scamander River, known to the ancients as Scamandros, winds through this landscape like a silver thread, carrying the stories of centuries in its patient flow toward the sea. This was a land that drew the eyes of gods and mortals alike, positioned at the crossroads of continents and cultures. The Dardanelles, that narrow strait barely a mile wide at its narrowest point, served as the gateway between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea's wealth and the Mediterranean's trade routes. Any power that controlled this passage controlled the flow of amber from the Baltic, grain from the Ukrainian steppes, and precious metals from Anatolia's rich interior. In the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, when the Great Pyramids of Egypt were still dreams in architects' minds, the first settlers looked upon this strategic hill and recognized its promise. They saw how it commanded views in all directions, across the plains toward the sea, along the river valleys that carved pathways into the interior, and over the strait that would one day be sailed by heroes and merchants alike. The hill itself rose approximately 90 feet above the surrounding plain, its slopes gentle enough for building yet steep enough for defense. Springs of fresh water bubbled from its base, ensuring survival even in the longest sieges. The soil was rich, dark earth that would yield abundant harvests of wheat and barley, while the surrounding pastures could support herds of cattle, sheep, and the horses that would one day thunder across Homer's verses. Ancient geographers knew this place as Ilios, while poets would call it Troy. But to understand the city that would capture imagination for millennia, one must first understand the land that shaped it. The Mediterranean climate blessed the region with mild, wet winters and warm, dry summers. Olive trees grew in silver-green groves along the hillsides, their fruit providing both sustenance and the oil that lit countless lamps in centuries to come. Grapevines climbed terraced slopes, their fruit destined to become wine that would flow. At feasts where bards sang of heroic deeds, the coastline in antiquity looked different from today's shore. The sea reached closer to the hill, and the Scamander's mouth created a natural harbour where ships could shelter from storms. Merchant vessels and war galleys alike would beach their hulls on shores that welcomed travellers from across the known world. Here, Phoenician traders would mingle with Mycenaean princes, Egyptian envoys with Hittite ambassadors, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that would define Troy throughout its long history. Wild game roamed the forested hills, deer and wild boar, wolves and lions that would inspire the metaphors of warrior poets. The forests themselves provided timber for shipbuilding and construction, oak and pine that would form the frameworks of palaces and temples. In the distance, the peaks of Mount Ida rose like sleeping giants, their slopes covered in pine forests, where the gods themselves were said to wander, watching the affairs of mortals with interest and amusement. Before archaeologists' trowels ever touched the earth of Troy, before scholars debated the reality behind Homer's verses, the city lived. In the realm of story and song, the myths that surrounded Troy's founding reach back into the misty origins of Greek memory, when gods walked among mortals and heroes were born of divine unions, according to the ancient tales, preserved in fragments of epic poetry and later chroniclers. Accounts, Troy's story begins with Dardanus, son of Zeus and the Pleiad Electra. This divine ancestor was said to have received the sacred Palladium image of Athena that fell from heaven, which would protect the city as long as it remained within its walls. Dardanus founded the first settlement in the Troad, establishing a bloodline that would endure through centuries of war and peace. The mythical genealogy continues through generations of kings, each adding layers to the city's legendary foundation. Tros, grandson of Dardanus, would give his name to both the city and the surrounding land, while his son Ilus would establish the citadel proper on the hill that archaeologists now call Hisarlik. These stories, passed down through oral tradition, for centuries before Homer ever composed his great epics, created a sense of divine destiny around the city. The most famous of Troy's legendary kings, Laomedon, was said to have commissioned the gods Apollo and Poseidon to build the city's walls. When he refused to pay them for their divine labor, their curse fell upon the city, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to its eventual destruction. His son Priam would inherit both the magnificent walls and the divine displeasure that would ultimately doom his kingdom. But beyond the realm of myth and legend, real human hands were shaping the destiny of this strategic hilltop. Archaeological evidence reveals that the first permanent settlement on the site dates to around 3000 BCE, during the early Bronze Age. These earliest inhabitants were part of the broader Anatolian cultural sphere, sharing pottery styles and building techniques with settlements throughout western Turkey. The founders of Troy, as archaeologists now designate this earliest layer, were skilled builders who understood both the defensive advantages and the commercial possibilities of their chosen location. They constructed houses of mud brick on stone foundations, their walls thick enough to provide protection from both weather and warfare. The settlement was small, perhaps housing no more than a few hundred inhabitants, but it was built to last. These early Trojans were farmers and herders cultivating the fertile soils of the Troad while tending flocks of sheep and cattle. They produced handmade pottery, dark burnished vessels that were both functional and beautiful, decorated with simple geometric patterns that spoke of an aesthetic sense refined over generations. Their tools were primarily of stone and bone, with copper appearing only occasionally as a precious material for special implements and ornaments. The dead were buried within the settlement, often beneath the floors of houses, suggesting strong connections between the living and their ancestors. Burial goods were simple but meaningful, pottery vessels to hold food for the afterlife, personal ornaments that had marked status or affection in life, and occasionally stone or copper tools that might be needed in the world beyond death, even. In these earliest levels, archaeologists have found evidence of trade connections reaching far beyond the Troad. Obsidian from the volcanic island of Melos in the Aegean, used for making sharp-edged tools, reveals contact with island communities hundreds of miles away. Shells from the Black Sea and Mediterranean beaches speak of coastal trading networks, while exotic stones suggest contact with communities deep in Anatolia's interior. For nearly 3,000 years after its final destruction, Troy lay hidden beneath accumulating layers of earth and vegetation, its location forgotten, its very existence questioned by scholars who wondered if Homer's great city had ever been more than poetic imagination. The hill called Hisarlik, its Turkish name meaning place of fortresses, gave little hint of the archaeological treasures sleeping beneath its gentle slopes. Local inhabitants had always known that the hill held ancient remains, farmers ploughing, their fields regularly turned up pottery sherds and carved stones, while shepherds occasionally discovered walls and foundations exposed by winter rains. But it would take the passionate obsession of one man to transform these casual discoveries into systematic archaeology. Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman who had made his fortune in trade and finance, arrived at Hisarlik in 1870 with Homer's Iliad in hand and an unshakable belief that the poet's verses described real places and events. Critics dismissed him as a romantic amateur, but Schliemann possessed two qualities that would prove crucial: unlimited enthusiasm and unlimited funding. His first excavations were crude by modern standards, driven more by treasure-hunting instincts than scientific methodology. Schliemann carved a great trench through the center of the mound, destroying countless archaeological layers in his haste to reach what he believed would be Priam's palace. His workmen labored with picks and shovels, moving tons of earth and debris while Schliemann supervised with barely contained excitement. What they found exceeded even Schliemann's optimistic expectations. Layer upon layer of ancient civilization revealed itself, each level representing centuries or millennia of human habitation. Walls of massive stone blocks, pottery in bewildering variety, bronze, weapons and tools, jewelry and ornaments the hills surrendered. Treasures that spoke of wealth and sophistication far beyond what anyone had imagined. Schliemann's most spectacular discovery came in 1873, when his workmen uncovered what he immediately proclaimed to be Priam's treasure, a collection of gold and silver vessels, jewelry, and ornaments that seemed to confirm his belief that he had found Homer's Troy. The discovery made headlines around the world and established Troy's place in popular imagination as a real historical site, rather than merely a literary creation, however. Modern archaeology would later reveal that Schliemann's dating was off by more than 1,000 years. The treasure he attributed to King Priam actually dated to around 2400 BCE, belonging to Troy, too, rather than the late Bronze Age city that would have been Homer's inspiration. But this did not diminish the significance of his finds, which revealed that Troy had been a center of wealth and power far earlier than anyone had suspected. Schliemann's enthusiasm was matched by that of his young Greek wife, Sophia, who shared his passion for archaeology and worked beside him in the excavations. Together, they endured the harsh conditions of fieldwork in the 1870s, living in primitive accommodations while directing gangs of local workers who gradually revealed the secrets of the ancient city. The couple's dedication to their work was evident in their meticulous recording of finds, despite the limitations of 19th-century archaeological techniques. Schliemann kept detailed diaries, describing not only the spectacular discoveries, but also the everyday pottery, tools, and building remains that would prove crucial for understanding Troy's development over time. As news of the discoveries spread, Troy became a sensation in European intellectual circles. Scholars, writers, and artists flocked to see the excavations, while newspapers carried regular reports of new finds. The site that had lived primarily in literature suddenly became a place where anyone could stand and touch stones laid by bronze. Age builders hold pottery vessels shaped by ancient hands and walk streets that might have echoed with the footsteps of heroes. The deepest levels of Troy, those earliest settlements that archaeologists designate as Troy I, II, and III, reveal a community that grew from humble farming village to prosperous Bronze Age town over the course of more than a millennium. These foundational centuries, spanning roughly from 3000 to 2200 BCE, established patterns of life and culture that would persist throughout Troy's long history. Troy I, the first permanent settlement, was remarkably sophisticated for its early date. The builders constructed houses with careful attention to both comfort and defense. Their walls thick enough to provide insulation against winter cold and summer heat. The houses were typically rectangular, with rooms arranged around central courtyards where families could gather for meals and work. Storage rooms held large pottery jars filled with grain, olive oil, and wine, evidence of agricultural surplus that allowed the community to support craftsmen and traders. The pottery of Troy displays a distinctive style that archaeologists have learned to recognize across the broader region. The vessels were handmade without potter's wheels, shaped by skilled artisans who understood both the practical requirements of storage and cooking, and the aesthetic preferences of their customers. Dark, burnished surfaces gave the pottery a lustrous finish, while incised decorations added geometric patterns that may have carried symbolic meanings, now lost to time. Defensive considerations were evident even in this earliest phase. The settlement was surrounded by a wall of stone and mud brick, while houses were built with few windows facing outward, presenting blank walls to potential attackers. Within the protected area, however, life proceeded peacefully, with evidence of children's toys, gaming pieces, and musical instruments, suggesting a community that valued leisure and entertainment, alongside the serious business of survival. Troy, too, which flourished from approximately 2600 to 2400 BCE, represents a quantum leap in both size and sophistication. This was the city that produced Schliemann's Priam's treasure, though it preceded Homer's heroes by more than 1,000 years. The inhabitants of Troy too were master builders who constructed massive fortification walls and monumental gateways that would have impressed visitors from across the ancient world. The most impressive structure of Troy too was its great a hall of ceremonial and administrative importance that may have served as the palace of the city's ruler. This building, with its columned porch and spacious interior, represented architectural concepts that would later become standard in Greek temple design. Here, the king would have held court, receiving tribute from subject territories and gifts from foreign ambassadors, while bards sang of ancestral heroes and divine favor. The wealth of Troy, too, is evident not only in Schliemann's spectacular treasure, but in the quality of everyday objects found throughout the settlement. Bronze tools and weapons demonstrate mastery of metallurgy, while intricate pottery vessels show artistic sophistication. Gold and silver ornaments suggest extensive trade networks that brought precious metals from distant sources, while exotic materials like lapis lazuli and amber reveal contacts reaching from Afghanistan to the Baltic Sea. The fortifications of Troy II were genuinely impressive, with walls of carefully fitted limestone blocks rising to heights that would have dwarfed potential attackers. The main gateway, reached by a paved ramp that forced visitors to approach slowly under the watchful eyes of defenders, combined practical military engineering with ceremonial grandeur. Here merchants would have displayed their wares for inspection by customs officials, while diplomatic envoys would have awaited permission to enter the city proper. Archaeological evidence suggests that Troy too came to a violent end around 2400 BCE, with traces of burning and destruction visible throughout. The site, whether this destruction resulted from warfare, internal conflict, or natural disaster, remains unclear. But the city's inhabitants apparently fled quickly, leaving behind many of their most precious possessions, including the treasure that would one day make Heinrich Schliemann famous, Troy III, which rose from the ashes of its predecessor around 2400 BCE, represented a period of reconstruction and consolidation. The new builders reused many of the stone blocks from Troy II's walls and buildings, creating somewhat smaller but still substantial fortifications. This phase of the city's history, lasting until approximately 2200 BCE, shows evidence of continued prosperity despite the traumatic destruction that had ended the previous settlement. The pottery of Troy III displays clear continuity with earlier traditions, while incorporating new influences that suggest contact with communities throughout the Aegean world. Imported vessels from the Greek mainland and islands demonstrate ongoing trade relationships, while local products show increasing standardization that may indicate specialized workshops serving markets beyond the city itself. As the third millennium BCE drew to a close and the early Bronze Age gave way to the Middle Bronze Age, Troy entered a period of steady growth and increasing regional influence. The settlements designated as Troy, IV and V, spanning roughly from 2200 to 1700 BCE, reveal a community that had learned valuable lessons from its predecessors' destructions and was building more cautiously but more permanently. Troy established around 2200 BCE marked a return to more modest building scales after the grandeur of Troy too. The new inhabitants constructed smaller houses and more compact fortifications, perhaps reflecting either reduced population or greater emphasis on practicality over display. However, this apparent modesty masked continuing prosperity, as evidenced by the quality of pottery, metalwork, and imported goods found throughout the settlement. The builders of Troy showed remarkable engineering skill in their fortification systems, creating walls that were both strong and economical. Rather than the massive stone blocks favored by their predecessors, they used smaller stones more efficiently arranged, creating defensive barriers that were just as effective but required less labor to construct. These walls were supplemented by towers and bastions positioned to provide overlapping fields of defensive fire. Perhaps most significantly, Troy 4 shows the first clear evidence of the potter's wheel in the archaeological record. This technological innovation, probably imported from the civilizations of Mesopotamia via trade networks, revolutionized ceramic production. Potters could now create vessels with greater uniformity and efficiency while developing new forms and decorative techniques that would become characteristic of Trojan pottery for centuries to come. The introduction of wheel-made pottery coincided with what appears to have been a significant expansion in trade relationships. Vessels from Troy 4 have been found at sites throughout the Aegean, while imported pottery at Troy itself reveals contacts stretching from the Black Sea to Cyprus. This expanding commercial network brought not only exotic goods, but also new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that enriched Trojan civilization. Troy V, which flourished from approximately 1900 to 1700 BC, represents the culmination of Middle Bronze Age development at the site. This was a city of considerable size and sophistication, with well-planned streets, efficient drainage systems, and buildings that combined functionality with aesthetic appeal. The fortifications were expanded and strengthened, creating a defensive system that could withstand prolonged siege, while protecting a population that may have numbered in the thousands. The houses of Troy V display a level of comfort and refinement that speaks to the city's growing prosperity. Many contained multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, with specialized areas for cooking, storage, and craft production. Some houses even featured primitive bathroom facilities, with stone-lined drains carrying wastewater away from living areas. A level of urban planning that would not become common in many parts of the world for centuries to come. Craft production in Troy V reached new levels of specialization and skill. Bronze workers created tools and weapons of exceptional quality, while jewelers worked gold and silver into intricate ornaments that rivaled the products of more famous centers like Mycenae and Knossos. Textile production, though leaving little direct archaeological trace, is indicated by the large numbers of loom weights and spindle whorls found throughout the settlement. The religious life of Troy V can be glimpsed through architectural remains and ritual objects scattered throughout, the site. Small shrines within houses suggest domestic worship, while larger buildings may have served as temples for community-wide ceremonies. Figurines of goddesses, some clearly imported from other regions, reveal religious beliefs that connected Trojan spiritual life with broader Anatolian and Aegean traditions. Perhaps most remarkably, Troy V shows evidence of literacy in the form of scattered inscriptions and seal impressions. While no extensive texts have survived, these fragments suggest the Trojan administrators were keeping written records of commercial transactions, legal agreements, and perhaps even historical events. This places Troy among the relatively small number of Bronze Age communities that had adopted writing as a tool of governance and commerce. The end of Troy, around 1700 BCE, appears to have been less traumatic than the destructions that had befallen. Earlier settlements. Archaeological evidence suggests gradual abandonment rather than violent destruction, perhaps indicating that the inhabitants relocated voluntarily rather than fleeing from disaster. This transition sets the stage for the even more remarkable developments that would characterize Troy Vi, the settlement that many scholars believe was the closest historical equivalent to Homer's Ilos. As Troy V faded into history, its legacy lived on in the accumulated cultural traditions, technological innovations, and trade relationships that would shape its successors. The techniques of fortification, the networks of commerce, the traditions of craftsmanship, and the systems of governance developed over these centuries would all contribute to making the later Troy one of the most formidable and prosperous cities of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean world. The archaeological layers of Troy I through V, representing more than a millennium of continuous occupation, reveal a community that had successfully navigated the challenges of Bronze Age life while building foundations for even greater achievements to come. Each generation had learned from its predecessors' experiences, adapting to changing conditions while maintaining the cultural identity that made Troy distinctive among the cities of its time. The stage was now set for the flowering of Trojan civilization that would inspire poets and storytellers for millennia to come. The morning mist rose from the waters of the Hellespont, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of a city that had learned to read the language of the sea. Troy's harbor, once a simple inlet where fishing boats bobbed like sleeping birds, now welcomed vessels from distant shores, their holds heavy with treasures that spoke of worlds beyond the horizon. The merchants came first, drawn by whispers, carried on Mediterranean winds. They spoke of a city where the old gods walked among mortals, where the earth yielded gold and silver as easily as wheat, and where the rulers possessed wisdom that could turn stone into prosperity. These early traders, weather-beaten men with eyes like deep harbors, anchored their ships in Troy's growing port and marveled at what they found. Here was no barbarous settlement clinging to rocky shores, but a civilization that understood the delicate dance between land and sea, between tradition and innovation. The Trojans had learned to speak the language of commerce as fluently as they spoke to their gods, and in doing so, they began to weave themselves into the great tapestry of ancient trade that connected the known world in the shadow of the growing citadel. The lower city spread like ripples on still water. Each ring of expansion told a story of calculated growth. For the Trojans possessed an almost mystical understanding of how prosperity flowed through a settlement. They built not merely to house their growing population, but to channel the forces of trade and worship, creating a sacred geometry that would endure for generations. The streets curved and straightened according to principles that seemed to blend practical wisdom with divine inspiration. The main thoroughfares ran like arteries from the harbor to the citadel, allowing the lifeblood of commerce to flow freely through the city's heart. Yet these same streets curved at precise intervals, creating spaces where merchants could gather, where children could play, and where the community could come together in times of celebration or crisis. The workshops of Troy's artisans clustered along these carefully planned avenues, their bronze hammers ringing out a rhythm that became the heartbeat of the city. Here, the metal workers shaped weapons that would become legendary, their techniques passed down through generations like sacred rituals. The bronze they worked was not merely metal, but a fusion of tin from distant Cornwall and copper from the mountains of Anatolia, each piece carrying within it the essence of Pharaoh's lands in the potter's quarter. Skilled hands shaped clay into vessels that would carry Troy's reputation across the ancient world. These were not crude containers, but works of art that spoke of a culture that understood beauty as a necessity, not a luxury. The pottery bore designs that told stories, geometric patterns that captured the movement of wind across water, stylized animals that seemed to breathe with life of their own. The weavers worked in spaces flooded with northern light, their looms creating textiles that would become as prized as gold in foreign markets. The wool came from flocks that grazed on the sweet grass of the Trojan plain, but it was the skill of the weavers that transformed this raw material into fabric fit for kings. They dyed their threads with purple from murex shells, with deep blues from indigo, and with reds from insects that fed on the roots of special plants. Each color carried meaning, each pattern told a story, and each finished cloth became a messenger of Trojan sophistication. As Troy's influence spread across the ancient world, the city became a crossroads where cultures met and mingled like tributaries, joining a great river. The trade routes that converged on Troy's harbor were more than mere paths for commerce. They were the veins through which the lifeblood of civilization flowed, carrying ideas, technologies, and dreams from one end of the known world to the other. From the east came caravans bearing the wealth of Asia, their camels laden with spices that could transform a simple meal into a feast for the gods. Cinnamon bark from Ceylon, black pepper from the forests of India, and precious saffron from the mountain meadows of Persia filled the air of Troy's markets with fragrances that spoke of distant lands and exotic cultures. These spices were worth their weight in silver, and the merchants who controlled their trade became wealthy beyond the dreams of common men. The northward routes brought amber from the Baltic shores, that fossilized resin that captured ancient sunlight and held it prisoner for eternity. The Trojans prized amber not merely for its beauty, but for its magical properties, believing it could ward off evil spirits and bring good fortune to those who wore it. The amber routes were treacherous, passing through dark forests where wolves howled and bandits lurked. But the profits were so great that brave merchants continued to make the journey year after year from the west, Ships arrive from the growing cities of Greece, their holds filled with olive oil that had been pressed from trees blessed by Athena herself. This liquid gold became the foundation of Troy's cuisine, its cooking, and its religious rituals. The oil burned clean and bright in the city's lamps, turning night into day and allowing the work of civilization to continue long after the sun had set. In return, the Greeks took back Trojan wine, made from grapes that grew in the volcanic soil of the nearby hills. Wine so pure and strong that it was said to carry the essence of the gods themselves. The southern routes connected Troy to the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, those lands where writing had been born and where the first cities had risen from the banks of great rivers. From Egypt came papyrus, that miracle plant that could be transformed into a surface smoother than the finest leather, allowing scribes to record laws, treaties, and stories with unprecedented precision. The Egyptians also brought gold, not the raw metal that could be found in many lands, but gold that had been worked by master craftsmen into jewelry and ornaments of breathtaking beauty. From Mesopotamia came the knowledge of the stars, carried by scholar priests who could read the movements of the heavens as easily as others read the expressions on human faces. They taught the Trojans to calculate the best times for planting and harvesting, for launching ships and conducting ceremonies. This celestial wisdom became one of Troy's most precious imports, for it allowed the city to align itself with the rhythms of the cosmos and to prosper in harmony with the natural world. With prosperity came responsibility, and with responsibility came the need for wisdom in dealing with the complex web of relationships that connected the cities and kingdoms of the ancient world. Troy's rulers understood that their city's position at the crossroads of trade routes made them inherently political players in a game that stretched from the Atlantic shores to the borders of India. The palace of Troy became a school of diplomacy, where envoys from distant lands gathered to negotiate treaties, arrange marriages, and settle disputes that might otherwise lead to war. The throne room was designed to impress, with columns of marble that seemed to reach toward the heavens and walls decorated with frescoes that depicted the great deeds of Troy's heroes. Yet beneath this grandeur lay a sophisticated understanding of human nature and the delicate art of negotiation. The Trojan kings learned to speak the languages of their neighbors not merely with their tongues, but with their hearts. They understood that true diplomacy required more than the exchange of words. It demanded the ability to see the world through another's eyes, to understand the fears and hopes that drove other rulers to make the choices they made. This empathy became one of Troy's greatest strengths, allowing the city to build alliances that endured through generations of changing circumstances. Marriage became one of the most powerful tools of Trojan diplomacy. The royal family carefully arranged unions that would strengthen existing alliances and create new ones, understanding that the bonds of blood could often prove stronger than treaties written on clay tablets. These marriages were not merely political arrangements, but genuine attempts to create understanding between different cultures, and many of them blossomed into love matches that produced children who embodied the best qualities of both their parents' peoples. The system of guest friendship that the Trojans developed became a model for civilized behavior throughout the ancient world. When foreign dignitaries arrived in Troy, they were not treated as potential enemies or mere trading partners, but as guests whose safety and comfort were sacred responsibilities. This tradition created a network of personal relationships that transcended political boundaries and often prevented conflicts that might otherwise have erupted into devastating wars. The Trojans also understood the power of cultural exchange, and they welcomed foreign artists, scholars, and craftsmen to their city. These immigrants brought with them new techniques, new ideas, and new perspectives that enriched Trojan culture immeasurably. The city's workshops became laboratories where different traditions met and merged, creating innovations that neither culture could have achieved alone. This openness to foreign influence was not seen as a weakness but as a strength, proof of Troy's confidence in its own identity and its ability to grow and adapt. Life in Troy moved to rhythms as old as the earth itself, yet refined by centuries. Of civilization into something approaching art, the seasons brought their own patterns of activity, their own celebrations, and their own challenges, and the Trojans had learned to work with these natural cycles rather than against them, creating a harmony between human ambition and natural law that would become one of their most enduring legacies. Spring arrived in Troy like a lover returning from a long journey, bringing with it the promise of renewal and the gentle urgency of new beginnings. The fields around the city burst into bloom, their colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with life. This was the season of planting, when the farmers would perform rituals as old as agriculture itself, scattering seeds that had been blessed by the priests and asking the gods to smile upon their labors. The city's gardens awakened from their winter sleep, and the air filled with the fragrances of jasmine, rose, and honeysuckle in the harbor. Ships began to arrive with increasing frequency as the winter storms gave way to the predictable winds of spring. The merchants who had spent the cold months in distant ports now returned with holds, full of treasures and tales of far-off lands. The marketplaces came alive with the sounds of bargaining, with the cries of vendors hawking their wares, and with the laughter of children who had been confined indoors for too long, and were now free to explore the wonders of their city. Summer in Troy was a time of abundance and celebration, when the city's prosperity was most visible and its people most content. The harvest festivals began in the early months of summer, as the first fruits ripened in the orchards and the grain began to turn golden in the fields. These were occasions for the entire community to come together, for rich and poor to share in the bounty that the gods had provided, and for the young to learn the traditions that connected them to their ancestors. The palace grounds became the setting for elaborate ceremonies that combined religious devotion with political theater. Foreign ambassadors were invited to witness these celebrations, and they invariably returned to their homelands with tales of Troy's magnificence. The ceremonies were carefully choreographed to demonstrate the city's wealth and power, but they also served a deeper purpose, reinforcing the bonds that held the community together and reminding everyone of their shared identity as children of Troy. The summer evenings were times for storytelling, when the elders would gather the young around them and speak of the great deeds of the past. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the repositories of the city's collective memory, the vessels in which the wisdom of the ages was preserved. The tales spoke of heroes who had walked the streets of Troy, of gods who had intervened in human affairs, and of the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined the human condition. Autumn brought its own magic to Troy, as the leaves on the trees turned colors that seemed to capture the essence of fire and gold. This was the season of the final harvest, when the last fruits were gathered and the wine was made from grapes that had absorbed the full intensity of the summer. Sun. The wine-making process was surrounded by ritual and ceremony, for the Trojans understood that wine was more than a beverage. It was a bridge between the mortal and divine worlds, a substance that could lift the spirit and inspire the soul. The autumn festivals were times of reflection, when the people looked back on the year that was passing and prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. The priests performed ceremonies to honor the dead, to thank the gods for their blessings, and to ask for protection during the coming winter. These rituals were deeply moving, filled with a sense of connection to the great chain of being that linked all living things to the eternal powers that governed the universe. Winter in Troy was not a time of dormancy, but of inner work, when the cities, artisans, and scholars turned their attention to projects that required patience, skill, and deep contemplation. The storms that lashed the coast kept most ships in port, but this enforced isolation became an opportunity for the community to focus on its own development, to strengthen the bonds that held it together, and to create works of art that would outlast the creators themselves. The great building projects of Troy were planned and executed during these winter months, when the minds of architects and engineers were free from the distractions of commerce and warfare. The city's temples rose, like prayers made manifest in stone, their proportions calculated according to mathematical principles that seemed to echo the harmony of the spheres. Each temple was dedicated to a particular deity, but all of them served the same fundamental purpose: to create spaces where mortals could commune with the divine and where the eternal could touch the temporal. The Temple of Athena, which crowned the highest point of the citadel, was perhaps the most magnificent of these structures. Its columns were carved from marble quarried in the mountains of nearby islands, stone so pure it seemed to glow with inner light. The proportions of the temple were based on the golden ratio, that mathematical constant that appears throughout nature and that the ancients believed held the key to perfect beauty. The effect was breathtaking. Visitors often found themselves moved to tears by the sheer harmony of line and form. Inside the temple, the great statue of the goddess stood in majestic silence, her eyes seeming to follow the movements of the worshippers who came to pray at her feet. The statue was carved from ivory and decorated with gold, but it was the expression on the goddess's face that truly captured the imagination. Here was divine wisdom made manifest, compassion tempered with justice, and power balanced with mercy. The statue became a symbol not just of the goddess, but of the highest aspirations of Troy itself. The palace complex grew organically over the generations, each ruler adding new wings and courtyards according to the needs of the time and the resources available. Yet despite this piecemeal construction, the overall effect was one of remarkable harmony. The buildings seemed to flow into one another like movements in a symphony. Each space serving its purpose while contributing to the greater whole. The throne room, the private quarters, the administrative offices, and the ceremonial halls all worked together to create an environment that was both functional and inspiring. The palace gardens were marvels of landscape architecture, designed to provide beauty and tranquility in every season. The gardeners, who were artists in their own right, understood how to use water, stone, and living plants to create compositions that seemed to capture the essence of paradise. Fountains played music with their falling water. Pathways curved to reveal new vistas at every turn, and the placement of trees and flowers created patterns of light and shadow that changed throughout the day like a slow dance choreographed by the sun itself. The residential quarters of the city were planned with equal care, for the Trojans believed that all citizens deserved to live in surroundings that nourished the soul as well as the body. Even the humblest houses were built with attention to proportion and detail, with courtyards that brought light and air into the living spaces and with decorative elements that spoke of the inhabitants' pride in their city and their culture. The streets were paved with stones fitted so precisely that water ran off efficiently, and the entire city was served by an underground network of pipes and channels that brought fresh water from mountain springs and carried away waste with remarkable efficiency. As Troy's power and influence grew, so too did the sophistication of its government and social institutions. The city developed a system of governance that balanced the authority of the king with the wisdom of the council of elders, creating a structure that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the stability that prosperity required. This system became a model for other cities, and its influence can be traced through the subsequent development of political thought in the ancient world. The Council of Elders was composed of men who had proven their wisdom through long years of service to the community. These were not merely the wealthy or the well-born, though both groups were represented, but individuals who had demonstrated their understanding of the complex forces that shaped human affairs. They included successful merchants who understood the intricacies of trade, military commanders who had led Troy's armies to victory, priests who could interpret the will of the gods, and scholars who had studied the laws and customs of other peoples. The council met in a chamber within the palace complex, a circular room designed to emphasize the equality of all participants. The walls were decorated with mosaics that depicted the history of Troy, from its legendary founding to its current glory, serving as a constant reminder of the traditions and responsibilities that the councillors had inherited. The discussions that took place in this chamber were models of civilized discourse, with each speaker given the opportunity to present his views and with decisions reached through careful consideration of all the relevant factors. The legal system that emerged from these deliberations was based on principles of justice and fairness that were revolutionary for their time. The Trojans developed a written code of laws that applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their social status or wealth. These laws covered everything from commercial disputes to criminal offenses, from family matters to religious obligations. The code was displayed publicly so that all citizens could know their rights and responsibilities, and it was enforced by judges who were chosen for their integrity and wisdom rather than their political connections. The system of education that Troy developed was perhaps even more important than its legal code, for it ensured that each generation would be prepared to carry on the work of civilization. Children from all social classes received basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, skills that were considered essential for participation in the life of the community. Those who showed particular aptitude were given advanced training in subjects such as mathematics, astronomy, rhetoric, and philosophy. The teachers were drawn from the ranks of the city's most learned citizens, and they took their responsibilities seriously. They understood that they were not merely transmitting information, but shaping the minds and characters of future leaders. The curriculum included not only practical subjects, but also music, poetry, and athletics, for the Trojans believed that true education must develop the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. The Library of Troy became one of the wonders of the ancient world, a repository of knowledge that attracted scholars from across the known world. The collection included not only works written in Troy, but also texts obtained through trade and diplomatic contact with other civilizations. These scrolls and tablets contained the accumulated wisdom of humanity, from technical manuals that explained how to build ships and forge weapons to philosophical treatises that explored the deepest questions of existence. The librarians were more than mere keepers of books. They were scholars in their own right who could guide visitors to the information they sought and who often contributed new knowledge through their own research and writing. The library became a center of intellectual exchange, where ideas from different cultures could meet and interact, often producing insights that neither tradition could have achieved alone. Religion in Troy was not a separate sphere of life, but a thread that ran through every aspect of daily existence, binding the community together and connecting it to the eternal forces that governed the universe. The Trojans worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own sphere of influence and their own particular requirements. But they understood that these deities were not distant figures, but active participants in human affairs who required respect, propitiation, and careful attention. The great festivals of the religious calendar were times when the entire community came together to honor the gods and to celebrate the bonds that held them together as a people. These celebrations were elaborate affairs that could last for days, involving processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and artistic performances. The festivals served multiple purposes. They reinforced religious devotion, strengthened social cohesion, and provided opportunities for the display of civic pride and prosperity. The Festival of Athena, held each year at the height of summer, was perhaps the most magnificent of these celebrations. The entire city participated in the preparations, with craftsmen creating new decorations for the temples, cooks preparing vast quantities of food for the communal feasts, and artists rehearsing the songs and dances that would be performed in honor of the goddess. The highlight of the festival was the great procession that wound its way from the lower city to the temple on the citadel, carrying offerings and sacred objects that represented the devotion of the entire community. The priests and priestesses who served the various temples were not merely religious functionaries, but important members of the community who wielded considerable influence in both sacred and secular matters. They were chosen for their wisdom, their moral character, and their ability to interpret the will of the gods. Many of them were also scholars who contributed to the intellectual life of the city, studying astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other subjects that were considered to be under divine patronage. The religious practices of Troy were characterized by a deep sense of reciprocity between gods and mortals. The Trojans believed that the gods required worship and sacrifice, but they also believed that the gods had obligations to their worshippers. This created a relationship of mutual dependence that was reflected in the prayers and rituals performed. In the temples, the people offered the gods the best of what they had: choice animals, precious objects, and heartfelt devotion, and in return they expected protection, prosperity, and guidance. The mystery cults that flourished in Troy offered a more personal and intense form of religious experience. These secret societies promised their initiates special knowledge and direct communion with the divine, experiences that went beyond the public rituals of the state religion. The mysteries were carefully guarded secrets, passed down from one generation of initiates to the next, and they provided a sense of belonging and purpose that complemented the broader religious life of the community. The burial customs of Troy reflected the community's beliefs about the afterlife and the continued existence of the soul after death. The dead were buried with great ceremony, accompanied by grave goods that would serve them in the next world. The wealthy were interred in elaborate tombs decorated with frescoes and furnished with precious objects, while even the poorest citizens received proper burial rites that honored their contribution to the community and ensured their peaceful passage to the realm of the dead. The art and architecture of Troy were deeply influenced by religious themes, with temples, statues, and decorative objects serving not only aesthetic purposes, but also spiritual ones. The artists and craftsmen understood that their work was a form of worship, a way of honoring the gods and expressing the community's deepest values and beliefs. The beauty they created was not an end in itself, but a means of connecting the earthly realm to the divine, of making the sacred visible and tangible in the physical world. As Troy's influence spread throughout the ancient world, so too did its religious practices and beliefs. The city became a pilgrimage destination for worshippers from distant lands, who came to pray at its temples and to participate in its festivals. This religious tourism brought not only spiritual benefits, but also economic ones, as pilgrims required food, lodging, and souvenirs, creating a thriving industry that contributed significantly to the city's prosperity. The synthesis of religious and secular life that characterized Troy became one of its most distinctive features and one of its most enduring legacies. The city demonstrated that it was possible to create a civilization that was both deeply spiritual and highly practical, both devoted to the gods and committed to human flourishing. This balance between the sacred and the secular would influence the development of Western civilization for centuries to come, providing a model for how societies could organize themselves around shared values and common purposes. Yet even as Troy reached the height of its power and influence, there were signs that change was coming. The very success that had made the city great was beginning to attract the attention of rivals who coveted its wealth and resented its dominance. The trade routes that had brought prosperity were also bringing new ideas and new challenges, as Other peoples developed their own ambitions and their own visions of how the world should be ordered. The gods themselves seemed to be stirring, as if the cosmic balance that had favored Troy for so long was beginning to shift toward new configurations of power and possibility. The citizens of Troy, comfortable in their prosperity and confident in their strength, were largely unaware of these gathering storms. They continued to go about their daily lives, pursuing their trades, raising their families, and worshipping their gods, believing that the golden age in which they lived would continue indefinitely. They could not have imagined that their city, which seemed as permanent as the mountains and as eternal as the sea, was about to face challenges that would test every aspect of the civilization they had built and the values they held dear. But that is the nature of human history. Periods of stability and prosperity are inevitably followed by times of crisis and change. The very forces that had made Troy great were also creating the conditions for its transformation, as the city's success inspired both admiration and envy, both imitation and opposition. The stage was being set for events that would echo through the ages. Events that would transform not only Troy, but the entire world of which it was a part. The winds that swept across the Hellespont carried more than salt and sea. They've carried the whispers of destiny, the murmurs of gods grown restless, and the distant sound of bronze grinding against bronze. In the royal quarters of Troy, where silk curtains filtered the morning light into golden streams, King Priam felt the weight of years settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead. The kidnapping of Helen had not been a moment of passion. Alone it had been the spark that ignited a fire long prepared. For generations, the delicate balance between East and West, between the established power of Troy and the rising ambitions of the Mycenaean kingdoms, had grown increasingly precarious. Trade routes that had once flowed peacefully through Trojan waters now bristled with tension. The tribute that lesser cities paid to Troy was questioned, challenged, sometimes refused outright. When Paris arrived at the gates of Troy with Helen beside him, her beauty seemed to carry with it the scent of inevitability. The Trojan elders, gathered in their council chamber where countless decisions had shaped the fate of nations, looked upon her face and saw not just a woman, but a symbol of everything their enemies needed to justify war. Some among them were old Antina, whose beard had whitened through decades of diplomacy, urged that she be returned immediately. Others, stirred by pride and the magnetic presence of Paris himself, declared that Troy had never yielded to foreign demands and would not begin now. Priam, watching his son's face as he spoke of love and divine favor, felt the terrible burden of kingship settle deeper into his bones. He had ruled Troy through 40 years of prosperity, had seen the city's walls rise higher and its treasuries fill with gold from 100 distant lands. Now, in the twilight of his reign, he faced a choice that would define not just his legacy, but the very survival of everything he had built. The king's decision to support his son was not made in ignorance of consequences. Trojan spies had long reported the growing alliance between Agamemnon of Mycenae and his brother Menelaus of Sparta. They had described the vast shipyards where vessels of war were taking shape, the forges where weapons were being crafted not for hunting or ceremony, but for battle, the network of obligations and oaths that bound the Greek Kingdoms together, the same network that had brought Helen to Sparta in the first place was now being activated for war. Yet Troy was not defenseless. The city that controlled the Dardanelles had not maintained its power through weakness. In the sprawling complex of the royal palace, where corridors led to armories filled with weapons from across the known world, Hector began the grim work of preparation. The king's eldest son, whose reputation for both skill in battle and wisdom in council had spread far beyond Troy's borders, understood better than most what was coming. The Trojan military was a reflection of the city's cosmopolitan nature. The core of the army consisted of Trojans, proper men, who had grown up within sight of the great walls, who had learned to fight in the shadow of the citadel. But around this core gathered contingents from across the region, Dardanians led by Aeneas, whose own royal lineage traced back to the goddess Aphrodite, Lycians under the command of Sarpedon, cousin to the storm god Zeus, Thracians whose wild cavalry had learned to fight in the vast steppes to the north. Each of these allies brought their own traditions of warfare, their own styles of combat, their own reasons for standing with Troy. For some, it was obligation, the complex web of treaties and marriages that bound the noble houses of Anatolia together. For others, it was opportunity, the chance to win glory and gold in what promised to be a war of epic proportions. For all of them, it was recognition that Troy's fall would leave the entire region vulnerable to Greek expansion. As winter gave way to spring, the preparations intensified. In the lower city, smiths worked day and night repairing armor, sharpening weapons, crafting new spear points and arrowheads. The great gates of Troy, which had stood open for so long that some of the younger citizens had never seen them closed, were tested and retested. The mechanisms that controlled the massive bronze doors groaned under the weight of years, but they still functioned a testament to the engineering skill of Troy's builders. The civilian population began the process of stockpiling that would define the next decade of their lives. Granaries that had been kept well stocked as a matter of prudence were now filled to capacity. Wells were deepened and cleaned. The remarkable system of underground cisterns that honeycombed the citadel hill a network of stone chambers and channels that could store water for months of siege was inspected and prepared. It was during these preparations that the first Greek ships appeared on the horizon. A few vessels at first, their black sails visible from the highest towers of Troy as they prowled the entrance to the straits. But as the days passed, their numbers grew. 10 ships became 20, then 50, then 100. The sea beyond the Bay of Troy began to resemble a floating city of wood and bronze, a forest of masts and sails that stretched from headland to headland. The Greek fleet that assembled off the coast of Troy was unlike anything the world had seen before. It was not merely a collection of warships, but a floating manifestation of an entire civilization's capacity for organized violence. From the deck of his flagship, Agamemnon looked out over 1,000 vessels and knew that he commanded not just an army, but the combined strength of 100 kingdoms. Each ship carried its own story, its own contingent of warriors bound by oath and honor to the common cause. The sleek vessels of the Athenians, their bronze-reinforced prows designed for ramming, carried men who had learned to fight both on land and sea. The larger ships of the Boeotians groaned under the weight of their cargo, not just weapons and armor, but the dismantled siege engines that would be needed to breach Troy's walls. From Crete came the contingent of King Idomeneus, their ships painted with the sacred double axe of their island home. These were warriors whose ancestors had ruled the seas when Troy was still a small trading post, whose palaces at Knossos had fallen to mainland Greeks generations before. Now they sailed north to join in what they saw as the next great chapter. In the struggle for control of the eastern Mediterranean, the Myrmidons of Achilles arrived in their distinctive black ships, their reputation preceding them like a shadow across the water. The greatest warrior of his generation, Achilles, had been reluctant to join the expedition. Prophecy had warned him that Troy would be the site of either his greatest glory or his doom. But the complex bonds of honor that governed heroic society had drawn him in despite his reservations. His presence in the fleet changed everything, adding a dimension of almost supernatural menace to the Greek forces as the ships drew closer to the Trojan shore. The complexity of the coming conflict became apparent. This would not be a simple matter of storm and siege. The Greeks needed to establish a base of operations, a place where they could beach their ships, set up their camps, and organize the logistics of a prolonged campaign. The bay near Troy offered good harbors, but it was defended by the city's walls and the network of smaller settlements that served as its outposts. The first landing was a test of will and skill that would set the tone for everything that followed. As the Greek ships approached the beach, Trojan defenders rushed to meet them at the water's edge. The sound of bronze clashing against bronze rang out across the water, while arrows whistled overhead and spears found their marks in shield and flesh. It was here, in this first chaotic engagement, that the heroes of both sides began to emerge from the massive warriors and take on the distinct identities that would define the war's progression. Hector, leading the Trojan defense, moved through the battle like a force of nature, his bronze armor catching the light as he rallied his men and drove back the Greek advance. His voice, calling out orders and encouragement, carried clearly over the clash of weapons against him. The Greek heroes proved their worth in individual combats. Ajax, son of Telamon, stood like a tower of bronze and leather, his massive shield deflecting spears and arrows while his sword carved a path through the Trojan ranks. Diomedes, youngest of the great captains, fought with the fury of a man who had something to prove, his chariot wheels cutting tracks in the bloody sand as he pursued fleeing enemies. But it was the appearance of Achilles that truly changed the character of the battle. When his distinctive armor caught the light, when his war cry rang out across the beach, something shifted in the very air around the conflict. The Trojans, who had been giving ground steadily, suddenly found themselves facing a warrior who seemed to move with inhuman speed and strike with divine strength. The beach where the first battle was fought would become, over the years that followed, a landscape of memory and legend. Every stone, every stretch of sand would acquire its own story of heroism and death. The Greeks established their camp there, dragging their ships up onto the shore and arranging them in a great semicircle that faced toward Troy. Between the ships and the city, the plain that had once been given over to farming and herding became a battlefield, where the fate of civilizations would be decided. The siege of Troy was unlike the swift campaigns that characterized most ancient warfare. It was a grinding, decade-long struggle that tested not just the military capabilities of both sides, but their entire social and economic systems. The Greeks, far from their home territories, had to maintain supply lines across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory. The Trojans, sealed within their walls, had to sustain not just their own population, but the refugees who had fled to the city for protection. As the first winter of the siege settled over the plain, both armies began to understand that they were engaged in something unprecedented. The Greek camp, initially a collection of tents and temporary shelters, gradually evolved into a semi-permanent settlement. Streets were laid out between the ships, areas designated for different functions, defenses erected to protect against Trojan sorties. Within Troy's walls, the rhythm of daily life adapted to the reality of siege. The agora, which had once bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean, now served as a distribution center for carefully rationed supplies. The palace, where King Priam had once held court for visiting dignitaries and allies, became a command center for the coordination of the city's defense. The war that unfolded between the walls of Troy and the beached ships of the Greeks was not merely a conflict between armies, it was a collision between two different visions of what heroism meant, what honor demanded, what the gods expected from mortal men. In the space between the city and the sea, where the grass had been trampled to dust and the earth stained with the blood of 1,000 battles, individual warriors rose to become legends whose names would echo through the centuries. Hector, Prince of Troy, embodied the ideal of the defender, a man whose courage was inseparable from his love for home and family. When he walked the walls of the city in the evening light, his presence was a source of strength for every citizen who saw him. Children pointed to his figure and felt safe. Women working in the courtyard felt that their labors had meaning. Old men remembered their own youth and felt pride in what their city had produced. His encounters with his wife Andromache and his infant son, Astyanax, became moments of profound humanity amid the terrible machinery of war. When he removed his bronze helmet so that its horsehair plume would not frighten the child, when he held his son against his chest and felt the small heart beating with life and innocence, he carried with him a reminder of everything the war was truly about. The city was not just walls and towers, it was the sum of all these individual lives, all these private moments of love and hope. Yet even as he cherished these moments of peace, Hector understood that his role as defender demanded sacrifices that cut to the core of his being. Each morning, as he donned his armor and prepared to face another day of battle, he felt the weight of every life in Troy pressing down upon his shoulders. The blacksmith's apprentice, the merchant's daughter, the old woman who tended the shrine. Of Athena of them looked to him for protection, and he carried their trust like a physical burden across the battlefield. Achilles represented a different kind of heroism, entirely one that burned with the intensity of a shooting star, brilliant and brief and ultimately destructive. His rage was not personal anger, but something far more elemental, a force of nature given human form. When he fought, he seemed to step outside the normal boundaries of mortality, moving with a speed and striking with a power that made other warriors look like children playing at war. The relationship between these two great warriors, the defender and the destroyer, the man who fought for love and the man who fought for glory, defined much of the war's emotional landscape. They were natural opponents, yet they shared a recognition of each other's excellence that transcended the hatred between their peoples. When they finally met in single combat, it was not just a duel between individuals, but a collision between two different ways of understanding what it meant to be human. The other heroes of the war each carried their own complexities, their own internal struggles with the demands of honor and the reality of mortality. Ajax, the great defender, whose shield was so massive that it could shelter an entire rank of soldiers, represented the stubborn endurance that kept armies functioning when brilliance failed. His steady presence in the Greek ranks was like a rock around which the tide of battle could flow without breaking the formation. Odysseus, whose cleverness would later become legendary, served as a reminder that victory often depended more on intelligence than on strength. In the councils of war, when the other Greek leaders argued for direct assault or heroic gesture, Odysseus was the voice that asked difficult questions about logistics, about the enemy's weaknesses, about the long-term consequences of each decision. His presence in the army was proof that the age of heroes was also an age of thinkers. Among the Trojans, Aeneas stood as both warrior and symbol of continuity. His reputation for piety, his careful attention to the rituals that maintained the favor of the gods, made him a natural leader for those who saw the war as a test of divine will. When he spoke of duty to the ancestors, of obligation to future generations, his words carried weight because they came from a man who had proven his courage in countless battles. The war years passed in a rhythm of attack and defense, of individual combat and mass engagement, of brief truces and renewed violence. Each season brought its own character to the conflict. Spring campaigns, when the grass grew green between the battle lines and the air was soft with promise, had a different quality from the desperate winter fighting, when snow mixed with blood and the very ground seemed to cry out for peace. The gods, according to the stories that would later emerge from the war, took sides in the conflict with a passion that reflected the stakes involved. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, favored the Greeks, while Apollo, god of light and prophecy, protected the Trojans. Their involvement was not merely symbolic, but practical. Divine intervention could turn the tide of battle, inspire a hero to supernatural feats, or strike down a warrior at the moment of his greatest triumph. Yet even the gods were bound by the fundamental laws that governed the universe. Fate, the inexorable force that determined the ultimate outcome of all things, could not be defied even by divine will. The prophecies that had been spoken before the war began continued to unfold with terrible precision, regardless of the preferences of individual deities or the heroic efforts of mortal warriors. As the war entered its final phase, the accumulated weight of years of conflict began to tell on both sides. The Greek army, originally composed of eager young warriors seeking glory and gold, now consisted largely of veterans whose enthusiasm had been tempered by reality. They had seen too many friends die, had endured too many winters far from home. had begun to question whether any prize was worth the price they were paying. Within Troy, the situation was even more desperate. The city's population, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside, pressed against the limits of the food supply. The great walls that had once been a symbol of strength now felt like the boundaries of a prison. Every death among the defenders was a loss that could not be replaced. Every injury a subtraction from the city's already stretched resources. It was in this context of mutual exhaustion that the most famous episodes of the war unfolded. The quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon over the captive woman. Briseis was not merely a personal dispute, but a symptom of the broader tensions that had developed within the Greek army. When Achilles withdrew from combat, taking his Myrmidons with him, the balance of power on the battlefield shifted dramatically. The Trojan counterattack that followed was the closest the city came to achieving outright victory, led by Hector. Emboldened by the absence of their most dangerous enemy, the Trojan forces pushed the Greeks back almost to their ships. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the entire Greek expedition might be driven into the sea, that Troy's walls would stand inviolate for another generation. But the intervention of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, changed everything. Once again, when he donned Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons back into battle, he carried with him not just the hope of the Greeks, but the terrible momentum of fate itself. His death at the hands of Hector was both the climax of his own heroic story and the catalyst for the war's final, devastating phase. The death of Patroclus transformed Achilles from a warrior into a force of pure vengeance, a man who had moved beyond the ordinary constraints of mortality and entered a realm where only destruction mattered. The grief that consumed him was not merely personal loss, but a complete negation of everything that had once given meaning to his existence. In losing his dearest friend, he had lost his connection to the world of living men. When he returned to the battlefield, the very nature of the conflict changed. The war that had been, for all its brutality, a contest between recognizable human beings, became something else entirely, a demonstration of what happened when divine power was channeled through mortal rage. The new armor that the god Hephaestus had forged for him blazed with supernatural light, and his presence on the battlefield was like a controlled catastrophe. The Trojan warriors, who had fought courageously against the Greeks for 9 years, found themselves facing something that their training and experience had not prepared them for. When Achilles charged toward the city walls, the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Rivers of blood flowed in his wake, and the air itself seemed to catch fire from the intensity of his fury. Yet, even in his transformation into an instrument of divine wrath, Achilles remained tragically human. The prophecy that had haunted him since childhood, that he would die young but win eternal glory, now seemed to be fulfilling itself with inexorable precision. Every step he took toward his revenge brought him closer to his own doom, and part of him seemed to welcome the approach of that final darkness. The confrontation between Achilles and Hector, when it finally came, was not merely a duel between two warriors, but a collision between two different fates, two different visions of how a hero should meet his end. Hector, defender of Troy, faced his death with the courage of a man who had always known that his duty might require the ultimate sacrifice. Achilles, avenger of Patroclus, approached the battle with the terrible calm of a man who had already moved beyond caring about his own survival. The fight itself was brief, decisive, and utterly without mercy. When Hector fell, pierced by the bronze spear of his enemy, something vital went out of Troy's resistance. The prince who had been the city's greatest defender, its symbol of hope and courage, lay dead in the dust before the gates. The psychological impact of his death was perhaps even more devastating than the military consequences. But Achilles' treatment of Hector's body revealed the complete moral transformation that grief had worked upon him. The man who had once been capable of nobility and honor now dragged his enemy's corpse behind his chariot, denying it the burial rites that even the most bitter warfare traditionally respected. In this act, he violated not just the customs of war, but the fundamental order that governed the relationship between life and death. The intervention of King Priam, who came alone to the Greek camp to plead for his son's body, marked the beginning of Achilles' return to humanity. When the old king knelt before the man who had killed his son, when he kissed the hands that had spilled so much Trojan blood, he appealed not to the terrible warrior, but to the grieving human being who still existed beneath the armor of wrath. The conversation between the old king and the young warrior was a moment of profound recognition, the acknowledgement that grief was universal, that loss was the price that all mortals paid for love, that even enemies could share the common burden of human suffering. When Achilles agreed to return Hector's body, he took the first step back from the abyss of pure destruction that had consumed him. The funeral of Hector was both a celebration of a hero's life and a recognition that Troy's fate was now sealed. The great pyre that burned on the plain before the city walls was visible from the Greek ships, and the lamentations of the Trojan women carried across the water like a preview of the city's final agony. With their greatest defender gone, the Trojans faced the last phase of the war with a combination of desperation and resignation. The death of Achilles, when it came, was both shocking and inevitable. The arrow that found the one vulnerable spot in his divine armor was guided by the god Apollo, but it was shot by Paris, the same man whose abduction of Helen had started the war. In this act, the wheel of cause and consequence completed its revolution, bringing the conflict back to its personal origins, even as it prepared for its cosmic conclusion. The funeral games held in honor of Achilles were among the most elaborate ever recorded, a testament to the recognition that something unprecedented had passed from the world. The competitions in chariot racing, wrestling, archery, and armed combat were not merely entertainment, but ritual acknowledgments of the heroic values that Achilles had embodied. Even in death, he remained the standard against which other warriors measured themselves. With both Hector and Achilles gone, the war entered its final phase, a period characterized not by the brilliant individual heroics that had defined the earlier years, but by the grim persistence of armies and leaders who had committed too much to turn back. The siege engines that the Greeks had brought from their homeland were finally deployed against Troy's walls, and the systematic destruction of the city's defenses began. The great stratagem that would finally breach Troy's defenses, the wooden horse conceived by Odysseus, was both a masterpiece of deception and a symbol of how the character of warfare had evolved during the long siege. No longer was victory to be won through straightforward heroic combat, but through cunning, patience, and the exploitation of the enemy's own customs and expectations. The construction of the horse was itself a feat of engineering that required the combined skills of the entire Greek army. The hollow interior had to be large enough to conceal a select force of warriors, yet the exterior had to be convincing enough to fool the Trojans into accepting it as a genuine offering to the gods. Every detail, from the choice of wood to the arrangement of the decorative elements, was calculated to exploit Trojan religious sensibilities and cultural expectations. When the Greeks sailed away, leaving only the great wooden horse on the beach, they created a moment of psychological complexity that would resonate through all subsequent military history. The Trojans, emerging from their city after 10 years of siege, found themselves confronting not just a physical object, but a test of their own wisdom, courage, and spiritual insight. The debate within Troy about what to do with the horse revealed the fault lines that 10 years of war had created within the city's leadership. The old counselors, led by Lacoon, urged caution and suspicion. They had survived too much to be easily deceived by Greek gifts. The younger voices, war-weary and desperate for any sign that their ordeal might be ending, saw in the horse a symbol of divine favor and Greek defeat. The decision to bring the horse within the city walls was made not through rational analysis, but through a combination of religious fervor, war-weariness, and simple human hope. The Trojans who dragged the massive construction through their gates were not just moving a piece of wood and bronze, they were embracing a vision of the future in which their suffering had meaning. Their endurance had been rewarded, their faith had been justified. The night that followed was the longest in Troy's history. As the city celebrated what it believed to be victory, as wine flowed and songs were sung and prayers of thanksgiving rose to the gods, the Greek warriors, hidden within the horse, waited in absolute silence. They could hear the sounds of celebration. Outside their wooden prison, could feel the rhythmic movements of the dancers, could smell the incense and roasted meat that marked the feast. When midnight came and the city finally settled into sleep, when the guards on the walls relaxed their vigilance and the streets emptied of revelers, the trap was sprung. The warriors emerged from the horse-like shadows, given substance, moving through the dark streets with the precision of men who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in their minds. The signal fires they lit on the city's highest towers called the main Greek army back from their hiding place on the nearby island of Tenedos. The fall of Troy was swift, brutal, and comprehensive. The city that had resisted the combined might of the Greek world for 10 years was overwhelmed in a single night. The walls that had seemed impregnable were breached from within. The gates that had remained closed for a decade were thrown open. The defenses that had held for so long collapsed like a house of sand in the royal palace. King Priam died defending the altar of Zeus, struck down by Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. The old king's death was both a personal tragedy and a symbolic end. To the age of heroes, the last of the great rulers who had shaped the early Bronze Age world fell beneath the sword of the next generation. With him died not just a man, but an entire vision of how kings should rule and how cities should be governed. The sack of Troy was an event that would define the Greek conception of victory and defeat for centuries to come. The wealth that poured out of the burning city, gold and silver, precious stones and fine textiles, works of art and sacred objects represented the accumulated treasure of generations. Yet even as they loaded their ships with spoils, the Greek warriors understood that they had destroyed something irreplaceable. The women of Troy, led into captivity by their conquerors, carried with them the memory of what had been lost. Cassandra, the prophetess whose warnings had gone unheeded, now spoke of the curses that would follow the victor's home. Andromache, widow of Hector, cradled her son Astyanax in her arms for the last time before he was thrown from the city walls. Helen, the cause of so much suffering, found herself once again a prize to be claimed and a symbol to be interpreted. As dawn broke over the ruins of Troy, as smoke from the burning buildings rose into the sky like incense from a massive funeral, the Greek warriors began the process of departure that would scatter them across the Mediterranean world. Some would find their way home safely, carrying with them stories that would become the foundation of Western literature. Others would wander for years, becoming the stuff of legend themselves. A few would never return at all, their bones joining those of the Trojans they had slain in the foreign soil they had conquered. But even as the physical city of Troy burned, even as its walls were torn down and its temples destroyed, something of its essence remained. The story of the siege, the tales of the heroes who had fought and died beneath its walls, the memory of what had been lost in that final, terrible night, all of this survived to become part of the collective memory of the ancient world. The bards who would later sing of Troy's fall understood that they were preserving more than just the record of a military campaign. They were maintaining the memory of a way of life, a set of values, a vision of what human beings could achieve when they committed themselves completely to something greater than their own survival. In their songs, Troy lived on not as a physical place, but as an idea, a standard, a reminder of both the nobility and the fragility of human civilization. The echoes of Troy's fall would continue to resonate through the ancient world and beyond. The story would be retold by poets and historians, would inspire new works of art and literature, would serve as a cautionary tale about the costs of war and a celebration of heroic values. In the end, the city that had been destroyed by the military might achieve a kind of immortality through the power of memory and imagination. As the Greek ships sailed away from the burning ruins, carrying their human cargo and their accumulated wealth toward an uncertain future, they left behind a landscape that would never be the same. The plain where armies had clashed for 10 years was scarred and empty, marked only by the burial mounds of the heroes who had fallen. The great walls of Troy lay in ruins, their massive stones scattered like the bones of some giant creature. Yet even in destruction, Troy had achieved something that none of its enemies could claim. It had become eternal, not in the sense of physical survival, but in the deeper sense of having passed into legend, into the realm of stories that define how human beings understand themselves and their place in the universe. The city that had controlled the Hellespont for centuries would now control something far more lasting, the imagination of the world that came after. The flames that consumed Troy's towers cast shadows that would stretch across millennia. In the smouldering ruins where once proud walls had stood, a silence descended that would endure longer than any kingdom, deeper than any ocean, more complete than any victory. the city that had been the jewel of the Troad, the guardian of the Hellespont, the bridge between East and West, now lay broken beneath the weight of its own legend. The survivors, those few who had escaped the massacre, scattered like seeds on the wind. Some, according to the ancient tales, followed Aeneas westward, carrying with them the sacred fire of Vesta and the promise of a new Troy that would one day rise on 7 hills beside the Tiber. Others fled eastward into the mountains of Anatolia, seeking refuge among distant kin, their names lost to history, but their blood flowing onward through generations yet unborn. The great King Priam lay dead in his palace, his body broken not by honorable combat, but by the cruel hand of Achilles' son, who had shown none of his father's complex nobility. The royal line of Troy, which had traced its lineage back through Laomedon to Tros himself, was severed like a golden thread cut by the fates' shears. The crown of Troy, if it had survived the flames, lay buried beneath ash and stone, its jewels, dim in the darkness of collapsed halls. Cassandra, the prophetess whose warnings had never been heeded, was dragged away to slavery and death, her gift of foresight now turned to bitter irony. She had seen this end so clearly, had spoken of it so desperately, yet none had listened. Her last prophecies, delivered in chains, spoke not of Troy's resurrection, but of the curses that would follow the victors home across the wind-dark sea. The gods, she declared, would not forget the sacrilege committed in their temples, the blood spilled on their altars. Helen, the face that had launched 1,000 ships, disappeared into the mists of competing stories. Some said Menelaus reclaimed her, that love conquered rage, that forgiveness followed fury. Others whispered that she had never been in Troy at all, that the gods had spirited her away to Egypt while armies fought over her phantom. Still others claimed she ascended to the heavens, her beauty too divine for mortal death. But the truth, like Helen herself, became ever more elusive as the years passed. In the aftermath of Troy's destruction, the great mound of Hisarlik began its long sleep. The wind, which had once carried the sounds of commerce and celebration, now whispered only through broken stones. Rain fell on marble floors that no longer sheltered kings, washing away the last traces of royal purple and gold. Seasons turned, without ceremony, winter's frost alternating with summer's heat, each cycle wearing away another layer of memory. The nearby settlements that had once thrived in Troy's shadow began their own slow fade. The intricate network of trade routes that had centered on the city fragmented and shifted. Ships that had once sought the protection of Troy's harbor now sailed past the silent coast, their captains perhaps noting the strange mound that rose from the plain, but not knowing what treasures lay buried beneath its earthen veil. Grass grew over the ruins, its roots penetrating marble and bronze, its green carpet gradually concealing the scars of war. Trees took root in the spaces where once grand halls had echoed with the voices of heroes and kings. The wild olive, sacred to Athena, spread its silver-green branches over stones that had witnessed the goddess's wrath. The laurel, beloved of Apollo, grew in groves where once the god's temple had stood, its leaves rustling with secrets that no human ear could understand. Time, the great healer and the greater destroyer, began its patient work. the sharp edges of broken walls were rounded by wind and rain. The bright colors of frescoes faded to gray and brown, their pigments returning to the earth from which they had come. Metal corroded and crumbled, except for the gold that lay hidden in the depths, waiting with the patience of the eternal forehands that would not come for centuries. Local peoples, descendants perhaps of those who had survived the siege, passed down stories of the great city that had once stood on the mound. But with each telling, the stories changed, growing more fantastical or more simplified, until history became legend and legend became myth. The specific details of Priam's kingship, of Hector's heroism, of the great siege itself, became confused with other tales, other heroes, other wars. The Scamander River, which had run red with blood during the siege, returned to its natural flow, carrying away the last visible evidence of the war. The plain where Greeks and Trojans had met in battle became a peaceful expanse of grassland, crossed by shepherds and their flocks. The tomb of Achilles, which had stood as monument to the greatest of the Greek warriors, slowly eroded away, its stones scattered by wind and rain until not even its location could be determined with certainty. Yet even as the physical city crumbled, its spirit lived on in the songs of wandering bards. These poets, heirs to a tradition that stretched back to the very siege itself, carried the story of Troy from court to court, from festival to festival, keeping alive the memory of heroes who had died centuries before. Their voices, trained in the ancient art of oral composition, wove together fragments of history and imagination, creating an epic that would outlive any monument of stone in the courts of Ionia, where Greek culture flourished under the shadow of the rising Persian Empire. The songs of Troy found their most receptive audience. Here, in cities like Smyrna and Chios, the descendants of those who had sailed to Troy's shores listened with rapt attention to tales of their ancestors' glory. The bards, competing for patronage and praise, refined their craft, adding new details, new speeches, new moments of divine intervention. It was in this tradition that the greatest of all bards, known to history as Homer, crafted his immortal version of the Trojan War, whether he was one man or many, whether he lived in the 8th century or the 7th, whether he was blind or sighted, matters less than the enduring power of his vision. In the Iliad, he captured not just the story of Troy's siege, but the very essence of heroic struggle. The tension between individual glory and collective duty, the tragic beauty of mortality in the face of eternal fame. Homer's Troy was not the historical city that had controlled the Dardanelles, but a Troy of the imagination, a place where gods walked among mortals and where human nobility could shine brightest in the face of inevitable doom. His Hector was the ideal of the defensive warrior, fighting not for conquest but for home and family. His Achilles embodied the warrior's paradox, choosing short life and eternal glory over long years in obscurity. The Iliad did not tell the story of Troy's fall that would come in later poems, now mostly lost, but it established the siege as the defining moment of the heroic age. Through Homer's art, the war became a cosmic conflict, a testing ground for human virtue, a mirror in which each generation could see its own struggles reflected. The poem was not history in the modern sense, but it was something perhaps more important, a truth about human nature that transcended the specifics of time and place. As the centuries passed, the Homeric poems became the foundation of Greek education and culture. Every schoolboy learned to recite passages from the Iliad. Every young man dreamed of achieving glory like Achilles or Hector. The characters of the epic became as real to the Greeks as historical figures, their deeds as inspiring as any recorded fact. Troy, the physical city, might have been forgotten, but Troy, the symbol, lived on in the collective imagination of the Greek world. The Romans, heirs to Greek culture, but also eager to establish their own heroic lineage, embraced the Trojan story with particular enthusiasm. In Virgil's Aeneid, the tale of Troy's destruction became the first chapter in Rome's own epic history. Aeneas, the Trojan prince who had escaped the burning city, became the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. Thus, the Romans could claim descent from the very heroes who had defended Troy against the Greeks, turning defeat into the seed of future triumph. Throughout the classical period, the site of Troy continued to attract pilgrims and visitors, though few could agree on its exact location. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, described the ruins of what he believed to be Troy, noting the remnants of walls and the foundation of temples. Yet even he admitted that the identification was uncertain that time, and human activity had obscured the ancient city's true form. Alexander the Great, during his march to conquer the Persian Empire, made a special detour to honor the heroes of Troy. He sacrificed at what he believed to be the tomb of Achilles, his legendary ancestor, and ran naked around the burial mound in emulation of the ancient Greek custom. He paid homage to Patroclus as well, while his companion Hephaestion honored Achilles, emphasizing the famous friendship between the two Greek heroes. The young conqueror saw himself as a new Achilles, destined to achieve glory in Asia, and his pilgrimage to Troy marked the beginning of his great adventure. The Roman Emperor Hadrian also visited the site during his extensive travels through the eastern provinces. A devoted Helen and lover of Greek culture, he was deeply moved by the associations of the place. He commissioned new temples and monuments, attempting to restore some dignity to the ancient site. Yet even Hadrian's efforts could not disguise the fact that the original Troy had been lost, that what remained was at best a shadow of the great city that had once commanded the straits. Julius Caesar, during his campaigns in Asia Minor, also made pilgrimage to Troy, drawn by the Roman belief in their Trojan ancestry. He walked among the ruins, reflecting on the cycles of history that had brought him, a descendant of Venus through Aeneas, back to the land of his mythical forebears. The irony was not lost on him. Rome, founded by Trojan refugees, had become the master of the world that had once been dominated by Troy's conquerors. These illustrious visitors brought attention to the site, but they also contributed to its confusion. Each generation of pilgrims found what they expected to find, interpreting the ruins according to their own understanding of the epic tales. The actual stratigraphy of the mound, the evidence of multiple cities built one upon another, was beyond their comprehension. They saw Troy as a single entity, not as the accumulated history of millennia. Local guides, eager to please their distinguished visitors, pointed out various features as the palace of Priam, the tomb of Hector, the altar, where Polyxena was sacrificed. These identifications, based more on imagination than evidence, became accepted facts, passed down from one generation of tourists to the next. The true history of the site became increasingly obscured by these accumulated layers of interpretation and wishful thinking. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, interest in the pagan heroes of Troy gradually waned. The site, now known by the Turkish name Hisarlik, meaning place of the fortress, was left to the care of local farmers and shepherds. The great mound, which had once been a destination for emperors and scholars, became simply part of the landscape, remarkable only for its size and the fragments of ancient pottery that occasionally turned up in the soil. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's eastern territories, maintained some awareness of the site's classical associations, but the empire's energies were focused on defending its borders and preserving its Christian identity. The pagan past, while not entirely forgotten, was relegated to the realm of curiosity rather than reverence. The Byzantines had their own heroes and their own struggles. They had little time for the ancient glories of Troy. During the medieval period, the Trojan story underwent a curious transformation in Western Europe. The Iliad itself was largely unknown, existing only in fragments and summaries. Instead, medieval writers relied on later Latin accounts, such as the supposed eyewitness narratives of Dictys, the Cretan, and Dares, the Phrygian. These fabricated works, which claimed to tell the true story of the Trojan War, portrayed the conflict in terms familiar to medieval audiences, with knights and chivalric codes replacing the heroic warriors of Homer. The medieval Troy was not the city of Priam and Hector, but a feudal kingdom, complete with courts of love and chivalric romance. The story of Troilus and Cressida, unknown to Homer, became one of the most popular tales of the Middle Ages, inspiring countless poems and plays. The historical Troy, meanwhile, lay forgotten beneath its mound of earth, as remote from these medieval fantasies as it was from the classical epics that had inspired them. The Crusades brought Western Europeans into contact with the lands of the ancient world, but their interests were focused on the Holy Land rather than the classical sites of Asia Minor. Knights and pilgrims passed through the region that had once been the Troad, but they were seeking the route to Jerusalem, not the ruins of ancient cities. The political instability of the region, contested between Byzantines, Seljuk Turks, and Crusader states, made scholarly investigation impossible even if there had been interest. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of a new era in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans, with their Islamic culture and their focus on contemporary concerns, had even less interest in the classical past than their Byzantine predecessors. The site of Troy, now firmly under Ottoman control, was left to the farmers and shepherds who had been its guardians for centuries. Yet even in this period of apparent neglect, the mound of Hisarlik continued to yield traces of its ancient past. Local people ploughing the fields or digging foundations occasionally unearthed fragments of ancient pottery corroded weapons or pieces of jewelry. These finds were curiosities rather than treasures, interesting enough to be saved, but not significant enough to attract outside attention. The accumulated artifacts of centuries of occupation lay scattered and unrecognized, their stories untold. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity, but this revival of learning was initially focused on the literary and philosophical heritage of Greece and Rome rather than their physical remains. Scholars rediscovered the complete text of Homer's Iliad, which had been preserved in Byzantine manuscripts, and found in it a richness and complexity that medieval summaries had only hinted at. The true Homer, with his psychological insight and artistic sophistication, revealed the Trojan War as something far more profound than a simple tale of conflict. The first stirrings of what would become modern archaeology began in the 18th century, driven by a combination of scholarly curiosity and romantic imagination. The Grand Tour, which took wealthy young Europeans through the classical sites of Italy and Greece, created a market for antiquities and a fascination with the physical remains of ancient civilizations. Scholars began to realize that the ruins and artifacts of the past could tell stories that no literary source could provide. In 1761, Robert Wood, an English traveler and scholar, published an essay on the original genius and writings of Homer, which argued that the Iliad was based on real places and real events. Wood had traveled through the Troad, had seen the mound of Hisarlik, and had become convinced that this was indeed the site of ancient Troy. His work marked the beginning of serious scholarly interest in the historical reality behind the Homeric epics. Wood's identification of the site was based primarily on its topographical features and its correspondence to Homer's descriptions. The plain of Troy, as described in the Iliad, was a specific landscape with particular features. The two springs of the Scamander River, one hot and one cold, the fig tree that served as a landmark, the ridge from which the gods watched the battle. Wood found these features in the landscape around Hisarlik and concluded that this must be the site of the ancient city. The French scholar Jean-Baptiste Le Chevalier, following Wood's work, conducted more detailed investigations of the site. In the 1780s, he created the first systematic map of the Troad, identifying various features mentioned in ancient sources and arguing for the historical reality of the Trojan War. Le Chevalier's work was more rigorous than Wood's, but it was still based primarily on literary evidence rather than archaeological investigation. The growing interest in Troy was part of a broader movement in European scholarship that sought to understand the historical basis of ancient literature. The work of scholars like Wolff on the composition of the Homeric epics and Niebuhr on Roman history had shown that traditional accounts of the ancient world were often more complex than they appeared. The question of Troy's historical reality became a test case for the new critical methods that were being developed. Yet even as scholarly interest in Troy grew, the site itself remained largely undisturbed. The Ottoman Empire, while not hostile to foreign scholars, was not particularly welcoming to excavation projects. The costs and difficulties of mounting a major archaeological expedition to a remote corner of Asia Minor were daunting. Most importantly, the techniques of systematic archaeological investigation had not yet been developed. The recovery of Troy would require not just scholarly interest and financial resources, but a new understanding of how to read the secrets hidden in the earth. The early 19th century saw a new kind of interest in Troy, driven not just by scholarly curiosity but by romantic enthusiasm for the heroic age. The Napoleonic Wars had awakened a new appreciation for military glory and individual heroism, while the Romantic movement in literature and art had created a taste for the sublime and the exotic. Troy, with its association with the greatest epic in Western literature, became a symbol of these new cultural currents. Lord Byron, the embodiment of romantic heroism, made his own pilgrimage to the site in 1810. His response was characteristically provocative. He questioned whether the great heroes of the Iliad had ever existed, whether the war had ever been fought, whether the entire story was not simply the creation of poetic imagination. Yet even his skepticism was a form of homage, recognizing the power of the Trojan story to inspire both belief and doubt. Byron's contemporary, the amateur archaeologist Lady Hester Stanhope, also traveled to the region, though she was more interested in biblical sites than classical ones. Her expeditions, funded by her own resources and conducted with a freedom that few male scholars could match, demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire was not as closed to foreign investigation as many had believed. Her example would inspire others to undertake their own expeditions to the ancient sites of Asia Minor. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1832, brought new attention to the Eastern Mediterranean and new sympathy for the Greek cause. Throughout Europe saw the modern Greeks as the descendants of the ancient heroes, fighting for their freedom against Ottoman oppression. This identification with ancient Greece naturally extended to Troy, which was seen as the first great conflict between East and West, the prototype of the struggle between Greek freedom and Asian despotism. The growing network of European diplomats and merchants in the Ottoman Empire provided new opportunities for investigation. The British, French, and German governments, competing for influence in the declining Ottoman Empire, were willing to support cultural and scientific expeditions that might advance their political interests. The study of ancient sites became a form of soft power, a way of asserting cultural superiority and historical connection to the classical world. Charles Maclaren, a Scottish journalist and scholar, published a detailed study of the Trojan topography in 1822, arguing strongly for the identification of Hisarlik as the site of ancient Troy. Maclaren's work was based on careful study of ancient sources and personal observation of the terrain. He argued that the mound of Hisarlik was not a natural formation, but an artificial tell created by centuries of human habitation. This insight, though not immediately accepted, would prove to be crucial for later archaeological work. Yet despite this growing scholarly consensus, the site remained unexcavated. The techniques of archaeological investigation were still primitive, based more on treasure hunting than systematic exploration. The great archaeological discoveries of the early 19th century, such as the Rosetta Stone and the sculptures of the Parthenon, had been largely accidental finds or the result of removing visible monuments. The idea of digging into a mound to recover the buried remains of an ancient city was still foreign to most scholars. The site of Troy, therefore, remained much as it had been for centuries. A large mound rising from the Trojan plain, covered with grass and wild flowers, grazed by sheep and goats, showing no obvious signs of its ancient glory. Local people still occasionally found fragments of pottery and metal in their fields, but these finds were curiosities rather than clues to a lost civilization. The great city of Priam lay sleeping beneath its earthen blanket, waiting for someone with the vision and determination to awaken it from its long slumber. As the 19th century progressed, the conditions for a major archaeological investigation of Troy gradually came together. The development of steamship travel made the eastern Mediterranean more accessible to European travelers and scholars. The construction of the Suez Canal in 1869 would further reduce the journey time to the Ottoman Empire, making extended expeditions more feasible. The growing wealth of the European middle class created a new market for books and lectures about ancient civilizations, providing financial incentives for archaeological exploration. More importantly, the techniques of systematic excavation were beginning to be developed. The work of Giuseppe Fiorelli at Pompeii, begun in 1860, demonstrated the importance of careful stratigraphy and systematic recording. Fiorelli's methods, which emphasized understanding the site as a whole rather than simply recovering individual objects, would serve as a model for later archaeological work. The science of archaeology, as distinct from treasure hunting or antiquarian collecting, was beginning to emerge. The political situation in the Ottoman Empire also became more favorable to foreign archaeological work. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century had modernized the Ottoman administration and created a more predictable legal framework for foreign enterprises. The Ottoman government, eager to demonstrate its modernity and cultural sophistication, became more welcoming. Two European scholars and their projects. The establishment of archaeological museums in Istanbul and other major cities showed that the Ottomans were beginning to appreciate the value of their ancient heritage. The German states, unified under Prussian leadership in 1871, became particularly active in archaeological work in the Ottoman Empire. German scholars had already made significant contributions to classical studies, and the new German Empire was eager to establish its cultural credentials alongside its military and economic power. The Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, founded in 1898, would become one of the most important sponsors of archaeological work in the Middle East. Yet it was not a professional archaeologist or government-sponsored expedition that would finally unlock the secrets of Troy. Instead, it would be a wealthy German businessman, driven by a lifelong obsession with Homer and a romantic belief in the historical reality of the Trojan War. Heinrich Schliemann, who would arrive at Hisarlik in 1870, brought to the site a unique combination of financial resources, boundless enthusiasm, and controversial methods that would forever change our understanding of the ancient world. Schliemann's approach to archaeology was shaped more by his business experience than by scholarly training. He believed in decisive action, rapid progress, and tangible results. He was willing to take risks that more cautious scholars would avoid, to make bold claims that more prudent investigators would hesitate to make. His methods would be criticized by later generations of archaeologists, but his discoveries would vindicate his belief that the stories of Homer contained kernels of historical truth. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of archaeological discovery. The sleeping city of Troy, which had lain undisturbed for centuries beneath its mound of earth, was about to be awakened by the picks and shovels of Schliemann's workmen. The results would be spectacular, controversial, and ultimately transformative for our understanding of the ancient world. The age of scientific archaeology was about to begin, and Troy would be its first great testing ground. As the 1860s drew to a close, the ancient city lay in its final moments of undisturbed rest. The wind still whispered through the grass that covered the mound, the same wind that had once filled the sails of Agamemnon's ships. The stones of Priam's palace, hidden beneath layers of earth and time, waited in darkness for the first glimpse of sunlight they would see in 3 millennia. The gold of Helen's jewelry, if it existed, lay buried in the depths, as bright and untarnished as the day it was crafted, dreaming of the hands that would one day hold it again. The transformation of Troy from legend to archaeological reality was about to begin. The city that had lived for centuries in the imagination of poets and scholars was about to emerge from the earth itself, bringing with it evidence of civilizations that had been lost to history. The silent mound of Hisarlik, which had kept its secrets for so long, was finally ready to speak. The ancient city stirs in its earthen bed, sensing the approach of those who would wake it from its long sleep. The age of discovery draws near, and with it, the reunion of legend and reality in the soil of Troy. And so the centuries passed like whispered secrets in the wind, each generation carrying fainter echoes of what had once been the mighty Troy. The shepherds who grazed their flocks across the wind-swept mound of Hisarlik knew nothing of the kings who had once ruled from that height, nothing of the ships that had darkened the waters below, nothing of the songs that had once filled the air with tales of heroes and gods. The Ottoman Empire rose and fell around these silent stones. Travelers passed by on the ancient roads, their eyes seeing only rolling hills where once stood the most famous city in the world. The mound itself became a curiosity, a place where local farmers occasionally turned up strange pottery shards and weathered stones that spoke in a language they could not read. Yet in the distant corners of Europe, in the libraries of scholars, and the studies of dreamers, the name of Troy lived on. Homer's verses continued to be copied and recited, translated into languages that had not existed when the poet first sang his tales. Young students in Greek and Latin classes learned of Achilles and Hector, of Paris and Helen, of the wooden horse and the fall of proud Ilium. To them, Troy seemed as mythical as Mount Olympus, as distant as the gods themselves. It was into this, the world of scholarly skepticism and romantic longing, that Heinrich Schliemann was born. In the small German town of Neubuchow in 1822, from his earliest years, the boy showed an unusual fascination with the ancient world, particularly with the stories told in Homer's great epics. His father, a poor pastor, would tell him tales from the Iliad and Odyssey, and young Heinrich would listen with eyes wide with wonder, dreaming of the day when he might walk where heroes had walked. Schliemann's path to Troy was neither straight nor simple. As a young man, he was apprenticed to a grocer, where he spent long hours grinding coffee and weighing goods, his mind wandering to distant shores and ancient battles. A chance encounter with a drunken miller, who recited lines from Homer in the original Greek, ignited in Schliemann a burning desire to learn the language of the poets. He taught himself not only Greek, but a dozen other languages, working by day and studying by night with a dedication that bordered on obsession. His natural gift for languages opened doors in the world of international trade, and he traveled from Amsterdam to St. Petersburg, from London to New York, building a fortune that would later fund his archaeological dreams. But money was never. Schliemann's goal, it was merely the means to an end. As he grew wealthy through shrewd business dealings and timely investments, particularly during the California gold rush, his thoughts turned ever more frequently to the question that haunted him. Where was Troy? Most scholars of his day believed that Homer's city was pure fiction, that the events described in the Iliad were no more historical than fairy tales. But Schliemann refused to accept this dismissal of the poet he revered above all others. In 1868, at the age of 46, Schliemann finally set foot in the land that would consume the rest of his life. He had studied every available text, every ancient source that mentioned Troy's location. Strabo, the ancient geographer, had placed it near the modern village of Bunabashi. Other sources suggested different locations, but one site kept drawing Schliemann's attention, the mound of Hisarlik, which the local Turks simply called the fortress. The mound rose some 100 feet above the surrounding plain, commanding views in all directions toward the Hellespont, where the Greek ships would have landed, toward the valleys through which armies would have marched, toward the distant peaks of Mount Ida, where the gods themselves were said to have watched the battle unfold. Standing on that ancient height, feeling the wind that had blown across the plain for millennia, Schliemann felt in his bones that he had found what he was looking for. But feeling and proving were different things entirely. The Ottoman authorities were suspicious of foreign treasure hunters, and Schliemann spent months navigating bureaucratic obstacles, learning Turkish customs, and convincing local officials that his intentions were scholarly rather than mercenary. When he finally received permission to excavate in 1871, he attacked the mound with an energy that shocked even his hardened Turkish workmen. What Schliemann discovered beneath the earth of Hisarlik would revolutionize archaeology, though not always in ways he intended or understood, using methods that would make modern archaeologists cringe, essentially cutting a great trench through the heart of the mound. He began to uncover layer upon layer of ancient occupation. Each stratum told its own story. Each revealed a different chapter in the long history of this strategic site. The deepest levels revealed the earliest settlement, dating back to the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE. Here were the remains of a small but prosperous community, already taking advantage of the site's commanding position over land and sea routes. Pottery fragments and simple tools spoke of daily life in an age when metal was still precious and rare. Above this earliest layer, Schliemann found evidence of Troy too, a much more substantial settlement that flourished around 2500 to 2300 BCE. This was a fortified city with impressive walls and gates, clearly the seat of some local ruler or dynasty. It was in this level that Schliemann made his most spectacular discovery, a cache of gold and silver objects that he immediately dubbed Priam's treasure. The treasure was extraordinary golden diadems and earrings, silver vessels and copper axes, thousands of gold rings and buttons. Schliemann was convinced he had found the personal possessions of King Priam himself, the ruler of Troy during the famous siege. In his excitement, he smuggled the treasure out of Turkey, creating a diplomatic incident that would shadow his work for years to come. But even as Schliemann celebrated his discovery, problems with his identification became apparent. Troy too showed clear signs of destruction by fire, which fit well with the story of Troy's burning. However, pottery analysis and other archaeological evidence suggested that this city had been destroyed around 2300 BCE, far too early to be the Troy of Homer's tale, which most scholars placed in the Late Bronze Age. Around 1200 BCE, undaunted, Schliemann continued digging above Troy to lay the remains of several more settlements, Troy 3, 4, and VH, representing centuries of continuous occupation. These were generally smaller and less impressive than Troy 2, suggesting that the site's importance had declined for a time, but they proved that Hisarlik had been continuously inhabited, that it was indeed a place where people had lived and died across the millennia. It was Troy VI that began to capture Schliemann's renewed attention. This city, dating to around 1700 to 1300 BCE, was much larger and more impressive than its predecessors. Its walls were massive constructions of carefully fitted stones, rising to heights that would have dwarfed most attackers. Within these walls lay the remains of a sophisticated urban center, with evidence of long-distance trade connections stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Troy was clearly a major power in its time, a city that could have commanded the respect and fear of other Bronze Age kingdoms. Its pottery showed influences from across the region: Mycenaean Greek styles, Hittite techniques, Egyptian motifs. This was a cosmopolitan place, a crossroads where cultures met and merged, where merchants from distant lands would have haggled in a dozen different languages. As Schliemann's excavations continued through the 1870s and 1880s, joined later by his collaborator Wilhelm Dörpfeld, a clearer picture of Troy's history began to emerge. Troy VI had indeed been destroyed, but apparently by earthquake rather than enemy action. Above its ruins lay Troy VIIA, a hastily rebuilt settlement that showed signs of having been besieged and finally destroyed by fire around 1180 BC. This date fit much better with the traditional timing of the Trojan War and Troy v. Many signs that archaeologists associate with a city under attack. Food storage jars had been sunk into the floors of houses, common practice during sieges when supplies were scarce. The population seemed to have been crammed within the defensive walls, with temporary structures built wherever space allowed. Most tellingly, the final destruction showed clear evidence of human violence rather than natural disaster. Was this, then, the Troy of Homer? The question fascinated scholars and the public alike, but the answer was not simple. Troy VIIA was Clearly a city that had endured a siege and fallen to attackers around the time that the Trojan War was supposed to have taken place. But it was smaller and less impressive than the mighty Iliad described in the Iliad, and its artifacts, while interesting, hardly matched the golden splendor that Homer attributed to Priam city. Yet, as decades passed and more careful archaeological techniques were applied to the site, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Perhaps Homer's Troy was not meant to be a historical documentary, but rather a conflation of memories. Memories of the great Troy vie at its height. Memories of the siege and destruction of Troy VII. Memories of other cities and other battles that had become woven together into a single, magnificent tale. The discovery of Hittite archives in Turkey added another dimension to the story. These cuneiform tablets, dating to the late Bronze Age, mentioned a city called Wailusa in the region where Troy stood. Linguists recognized that Wailusa was probably the Hittite version of the name Iliason, other name for Troy in the Greek texts. The Hittite documents spoke of diplomatic relations with Wailusa, of treaties and conflicts, of a city important enough to merit the attention of the great Hittite Empire. More intriguingly, the Hittite texts mentioned conflicts between their vassals and peoples they called the Ahiawa, name that bore a striking resemblance to Achaeans, Homer's term for the Greeks who besieged Troy. The historical picture became even more complex when archaeologists found evidence that Mycenaean Greeks had indeed been active in western Anatolia during the late Bronze Age, that they had traded, fought, and settled in the very region where Troy stood. Slowly, painstakingly, the archaeological evidence began to support the possibility that some kind of conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and the city of Troy had indeed taken place in the late Bronze Age. It might not have been the 10-year siege of Homer's imagination, with its gods and heroes and supernatural interventions, but something had happened at Troy, something significant enough to be remembered in song and story across the dark centuries that followed the Bronze Age. Collapse. Schliemann died in 1890, convinced that he had vindicated Homer and proven that the great epics were based on historical events. His legacy was complex. His discoveries had indeed revealed the existence of Bronze Age Troy and proven that Homer's geographical descriptions were remarkably accurate. But his methods had also destroyed irreplaceable archaeological evidence, and his interpretations were often more enthusiastic than scientific. The work at Troy continued long after Schliemann's death, each new generation of archaeologists bringing more sophisticated techniques and more nuanced interpretations. Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who had worked with Schliemann, continued excavations with greater attention to stratigraphy and context. Carl Blegen, an American archaeologist, spent decades in the 1930s and 1950s, refining the chronology and expanding understanding of Troy's various phases in the late 20th century. A new phase of investigation began under the direction of Manfred Kaufmann of the University of Tübingen, using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other non-invasive techniques. Kaufmann's team revealed that Troy had been much larger than previously thought. The citadel that earlier archaeologists had excavated was only the upper city, the fortress and palace complex of the rulers. Below and around it stretched a substantial lower city. protected by a massive ditch and palisade system. This revelation transformed understanding of Troy's importance in the Late Bronze Age, rather than a small fortress controlling the Dardanelles. Troy the Sixth and Veia now appeared to have been major urban centers, with populations in the thousands and influence extending far beyond their immediate region. Such a city would indeed have been worth besieging, worth the kind of international effort that Homer describes in the Iliad. The new excavations also revealed extensive evidence of Troy's trading connections. Pottery from across the eastern Mediterranean testified to commercial relationships spanning hundreds of miles. Horse bones suggested that Troy had been a center for horse breeding and training fitting, given that the Trojans were traditionally famous for their horsemanship. Textile production facilities indicated specialized craft industries, serving markets far beyond the local region. Perhaps most intriguingly, the modern excavations uncovered clear evidence that Troy had been abandoned and resettled multiple times, that it had endured not just one destruction, but many. The famous burning that destroyed Troy Via was only one episode in a long history of rise and fall, construction and destruction, prosperity and decline. The site's strategic importance had made it both wealthy and vulnerable, a prize worth fighting for across the centuries. DNA analysis of human remains found at Troy has added another dimension to our understanding of the city's inhabitants. The population appears to have been ethnically diverse, including not only local Anatolian peoples, but also individuals whose genetic markers suggest origins in the Balkans, the Greek islands, and even more distant regions. This genetic diversity supports the picture of Troy as a cosmopolitan trading center, a place where peoples from across the eastern Mediterranean came to live, work, and intermarry. Despite more than a century and a half of archaeological investigation, Troy continues to guard its secrets jealously. We know that a great city once stood on the hill of Hisarlik, that it was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, that it played an important role in the political and economic networks of the Late Bronze Age. We know that conflicts occurred between Mycenaean Greeks and the cities of Western Anatolia, that these conflicts were remembered and commemorated in later Greek tradition. But the precise relationship between the archaeological Troy and Homer's Ilium remains tantalizingly unclear. Did a Mycenaean coalition really besiege Troy for 10 years? Was there truly a warrior named Achilles whose rage shaped the course of the war? Did the city really fall through the deception of a wooden horse? These questions cannot be answered. Through archaeology alone, they belong to the realm where history and legend intertwine, where the boundaries between fact and poetry blur. What we can say with certainty is that Troy was no fantasy. The city existed, prospered, and fell multiple times across more than 3 millennia of occupation. Its rulers commanded resources substantial enough to build massive fortifications and maintain extensive trade networks. Its destruction was traumatic enough to be remembered across the dark centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse, to be woven into the songs and stories that eventually became Homer's immortal epics. Modern visitors to Troy find themselves walking through a landscape layered with time and meaning. The archaeological site preserves remains from all periods of Troy's long history: Bronze Age walls and Roman temples, medieval Byzantine churches, and Ottoman graves. A replica of the famous wooden horse stands near the entrance, reminding visitors of the legendary siege, even as they explore the very real foundations of ancient buildings. The site's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1998 recognizes both its archaeological importance and its cultural significance. Troy belongs not just to Turkey, where it stands, but to all humanity. It is a place where the earliest written literature of the Western world meets tangible archaeological reality, where the boundary between myth and history dissolves into something more complex and more profound. Each year, thousands of visitors climb the hill of Hisarlik, drawn by the same fascination that once drove Heinrich Schliemann to dig through layers of accumulated time. They come seeking connection with the heroes of Homer's tales, hoping to stand where Achilles and Hector might have fought, where Helen's beauty might have launched 1,000 ships. What they find is both more and less than they expect. The golden towers of poetry, but the weathered stones of reality. Testament to human ambition and human frailty across the ages. The influence of Troy extends far beyond its archaeological boundaries, far beyond even the considerable impact of Homer's epics. The city has become a symbol, a metaphor, a touchstone for ideas about war and peace, love and betrayal, the rise and fall of civilizations. Writers from Virgil to Joyce have drawn inspiration from Troy's story, finding in its ancient tragedy reflections of their own times and concerns. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century BCE, reimagined Troy's fall as the beginning of Rome's rise, making the Trojan Aeneas the ancestor of the Roman people. In Virgil's hands, Troy's destruction became not just an ending but a transformation, the necessary prelude to a greater destiny. Medieval writers saw in Troy's story parallels to their own concerns about honor, loyalty, and the proper conduct of war. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in Troy as scholars rediscovered and retranslated Homer's Greek texts. Artists painted scenes from the Trojan War, architects designed buildings inspired by classical themes. Poets wrote new versions of ancient stories. Troy became part of the cultural vocabulary of educated Europeans, a shared reference point that could convey complex ideas about heroism, fate, and the human condition. In the modern era, Troy has continued to serve as a mirror for contemporary concerns. During the world wars of the 20th century, many saw parallels between the siege of Troy and the massive conflicts devastating Europe. The story of a long, brutal war fought over seemingly intractable differences resonated powerfully with people experiencing their own age of unprecedented destruction. Feminist scholars have found in Troy's story rich material for examining the role of women in war and society. Helen, traditionally blamed for causing the Trojan War through her adultery, has been reinterpreted as a victim of male violence and political maneuvering. Cassandra, the prophetess, doomed never to be believed, has become a symbol of women's voices ignored by patriarchal authority. Even Penelope, Odysseus's faithful wife, has been seen as representing the often overlooked experiences of those who wait at home while men fight their wars. Anthropologists and sociologists have used Troy as a case study in the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, examining how environmental changes, population movements, and technological innovations combined to bring down entire cultural systems. The end of Troyvia coincided with a broader pattern of destruction and abandonment that affected cities across the eastern Mediterranean, from Mycenae in Greece to Ugarit in Syria. This broader context has led some scholars to question whether the destruction of Troy should be understood primarily in terms of Greek-Trojan conflict, as Homer suggests, or as part of larger patterns of migration and societal change. The mysterious sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian texts may have been responsible for many late Bronze Age destructions, including possibly Troy's final burning. Psychologists have found in Troy's story archetypal patterns that seem to recur across human cultures and historical periods. The themes of honor and shame, loyalty and betrayal, love and war that drive the Iliad appear to reflect fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization. Carl Jung and his followers saw in the Trojan War a manifestation of universal psychological conflicts played out on a collective scale. Modern technology has opened new possibilities for understanding Troy's place in ancient history and literature. Computer modeling has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the appearance of different phases of the city, giving us visual representations of how Troy might have looked at various points in its long development. Digital humanities projects have mapped the influence of Trojan themes in world literature, tracing how Homer's stories have been retold, adapted, and reimagined across cultures and centuries. Genetic studies of modern populations in the Eastern Mediterranean have revealed patterns of migration and settlement that may reflect movements of peoples in the late Bronze Age. While these studies cannot prove specific historical events like the Trojan War, they do provide context for understanding the complex ethnic and cultural mixing that characterized the region during Troy's heyday. As the 21st century progresses, Troy continues to reveal new secrets while raising new questions. Climate change research has shown that the late Bronze Age was a period of significant environmental stress in the eastern Mediterranean, with evidence for drought, crop failures, and social disruption. These environmental factors may have contributed to the political instability that led to widespread warfare and urban collapse, including the destruction of Troy. Archaeological techniques continue to evolve, offering new ways to examine old questions. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed structures beneath Troy that have never been excavated. Underwater archaeology in the nearby Dardanelles has uncovered evidence of ancient harbors and shipwrecks that testify to the region's importance as a maritime crossroads. Paleobotanical studies of ancient pollen and seeds have reconstructed the changing landscape around Troy, showing how human activity and climate change combined to transform the region over millennia. Perhaps most significantly, Troy has become a symbol of the complex relationship between archaeology and cultural heritage in the modern world. The long dispute over Priam's treasure, which Schliemann smuggled out of Turkey and which spent decades in German and Russian museums, reflects broader questions about who owns the past and how archaeological discoveries should be preserved and displayed. The treasure itself tells a story almost as dramatic as any in Homer. After Schliemann's death, it was housed in Berlin's museum, Vervor und Fröhlich. During World War II, as Allied bombing intensified, the treasure was moved to a bunker for safekeeping. When the Soviets captured Berlin in 1945, they seized the treasure along with many other cultural artifacts, transporting it secretly to Moscow, where it remained hidden for decades. Only in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did Russian authorities acknowledge that they possessed Schliemann's finds. The revelation sparked a complex international dispute involving Turkey, Germany, and Russia, each with legitimate claims to the artifacts. Turkey argued that the treasure had been illegally removed from Turkish soil. Germany claimed ownership, based on Schliemann's donation to German museums. Russia asserted rights based on seizure as war reparations. The case of Priam's treasure illustrates the tangled legacy of archaeology's colonial past, when European and American archaeologists often worked in foreign countries with minimal oversight or local involvement. Modern archaeological practice emphasizes collaboration with local communities and respect for national sovereignty over cultural heritage, principles that would have prevented many of the disputes that surround older discoveries. Today, Troy serves as a model for international cooperation in archaeological research. The current excavations involve scholars from Turkey, Germany, the United States, and other countries, working together to understand the site's complex history. Local Turkish authorities play a leading role in research planning and artifact preservation, ensuring that Troy's heritage benefits the people of the region where it stands. The site's development as a tourist destination has brought both opportunities and challenges. Thousands of visitors each year provide economic benefits to the local community, but they also pose conservation challenges for fragile archaeological remains. Balancing public access with preservation requires constant vigilance and careful planning, ensuring that future generations will be able to experience Troy's wonder and mystery. Educational programs at Troy now emphasize not just the site's connection to Homer's epics, but its broader significance in human history. School groups learn about Bronze Age trade networks, archaeological methodology, and the complex relationships between literature and history. International scholars use Troy as a case study in interdisciplinary research, showing how archaeology, history, literature, and science can work together to illuminate the past. As we stand today on the hill of Hisarlik, looking out over the plain where armies may once have clashed, we see layers of meaning as complex as the archaeological strata beneath our feet. We see the Bronze Age city that commanded the Dardanelles, the legendary Troy of Homer's imagination, the Ottoman village that knew nothing of its glorious past, the archaeological site that has taught us so much about ancient history and methodology, with C2, the ongoing story of human fascination with the past, the enduring power of great literature to inspire scientific discovery, the complex relationships between myth and reality, between poetry and archaeology, between local heritage and universal significance. Troy belongs to its time and to all times, to Turkey and to the world, to history and to imagination. In the end, perhaps it matters less whether the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer described, than that it continues to happen in our imagination, continues to offer insights into the human condition, and continues to remind us that great stories have the power to outlast the cities that inspired them. Troy fell, but its song endures, echoing across the centuries like the wind that still blows across the Trojan plain. The stones may crumble, the walls may fall, but the story lives in every reader who opens the Iliad for the first time, in every visitor who climbs the ancient hill, in every archaeologist who carefully brushes dirt from a potsherd that might tell us something new about how people lived and died 3,000 years ago. This is Troy's true immortality, not in gold or glory, but in memory, in wonder, in the endless human desire to understand who we are and where we came from. Beneath layers of time, only silence remains, yet silence remembers. The wind that whispers through the ruins carries voices from ages past, stories too powerful to die, dreams too beautiful to forget. Here, where legend and history intertwine like lovers' hands, the eternal city lives on, not in stone and bronze, but in the deathless realm of human imagination, where heroes still walk and Troy still stands. Golden in the setting sun, you've traveled through the complete story of Troy, from its legendary origins to its eternal legacy. If these timeless tales have moved you, if they've helped you find peace in the quiet hours, consider sharing this journey with others who might find comfort in history's embrace. Like, share, and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History. Let these ancient stories find new hearts, new dreamers, new souls seeking rest in the wisdom of ages past. Your support helps keep these voices from the past alive for future generations to discover and cherish.